Hi, this is David Mears. I am the Executive Director of Audubon Vermont. Welcome to all of you who have come to join our conversation tonight, our tough conversation about race and the environment. I'm super excited about the fantastic panels that we have assembled here tonight. And the topic is timely. We have a mixed history in the environmental movement, strands that include both a connection to the social justice and racial justice movements, but also a strand that's very exclusionary and frankly racist. And so of course, it's a topic that's very timely and important. And who better to lead us through that conversation than a group of law students who have been thinking and writing and working in this area. I'm very pleased that we've got a couple of Vermont Law School students who have been interning with Audubon Vermont this summer and are going to lead us in a conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Lauren Saylor, who will introduce our panelists and kick this off. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, David. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And welcome to Audubon Vermont's webinar on Tough Conversations, Race and the Environment. My name is Lauren Saylor, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy research intern at Audubon Vermont. Tonight, I'll be facilitating the conversation between 4 Vermont Law School students on the connections between racism, the environment, and the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the barriers to progress on these issues. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others shook the nation. Blackbirder Christian Cooper's experience in Central Park also rattled the birding community, bringing into focus the relation between racism and the environment. If you haven't seen it already, I encourage you to look up the video. These events sparked a global conversation on the ways in which racism affects personal welfare. Discourse thus far is focused largely upon police brutality, and justifiably so. However, white supremacy pervades many social and legal institutions with the environmental movement. Our goal at Audubon Vermont is not just to dismantle systemic racism embedded in the environmental movement, but also to highlight the ways in which the environmental movement can advance racial justice. There are a myriad of opportunities to build a stronger movement through inclusion, and one of these ways is highlighting the voices of those who are excluded. And that's why Audubon Vermont assembled fresh perspectives from youth activists with education and experience on these issues. Our goal with this webinar is to encourage mindfulness every day as to how race and the environment are 2 aspects of a broader, dominant perspective, the white, Western, patriarchal, capitalistic paradigm. Without seeing these connections and building alliances across these struggles, we cannot achieve an equitable society. So with that, Dan, could you please go to the next slide? Thanks, Dan. I'll just be going through some key definitions, starting with what is a racist and what is an anti-racist. A racist is one who is supporting a racist policy, while an anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy. And the key here is that an anti-racist is doing this through their actions or they're expressing an anti-racist idea. Next slide, please. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups, while an anti-racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. Next slide, please. Environmental justice, according to the EPA, is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Next slide. BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and POC stands for People of Color. Next slide.
Okay, I'm Mariah. I'm the other policy research intern. I'm going to be moderating and posing the questions to the panelists, but first I wanted to let them introduce themselves. So Jameson, if you could unmute and introduce yourself.
Good evening, everybody. How you doing? My name is Jameson Davis. I'm a third-year law student at Vermont Law School. One of the many co-founders of the Environmental Justice Law Society at Vermont Law School, and a former select board member for the town of Hartford. Thank you for being with us.
Ariel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel King. I am also a 3L at Vermont Law School and also one of the co-founders of the Environmental Justice Law Society. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Jerry?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jerry. I am also a rising 3L at Vermont Law. I also serve as the Environmental Justice Editor on the Vermont Journal of Environmental Law. And yeah, thank you for having me. And since we're with the Audubon Society, my favorite bird is the tui, native to New Zealand.
Justin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Kim. I'm a third-year law student as well at Vermont Law School and a very enthusiastic birder. Favorite bird is probably the Cape May warbler.
Awesome. And I forgot to mention my favorite bird is the cassowary, which I got to see in Australia. Super scary, super cool. And with that, let's start the questions. So the first one is, what is your personal relationship to the environment? Could you speak to the importance of BIPOC visibility in the outdoors and or barriers to BIPOC inclusion? And Ariel, if you want to start off.
Sure. So I guess to first answer that question, my relationship with nature and to nature, I've been very fortunate in that I've had opportunities as a person raised in an urban area to be able to go explore the outdoors. There are lots of programs that exist specifically for, I guess, inner city kids to be able to go outside. And I was a participant in a lot of them, including Young Women at the Helm, based on the Hudson River. And I did some camps in the Catskills and all of this stuff. So I was very fortunate at a young age to get involved in, outdoor activities and things of that nature. In college, I studied environmental studies, and here at Vermont Law School, I've been able to focus a lot of my attention on environmental justice. But in my environmental studies education, I acknowledge and I recognize that a lot of BIPOC communities have been removed from green spaces and historically kept out of the mainstream environmentalist movement, irrespective of the very significant contributions to the environmental movement, environmental protection, and the formation of the United States and what it is today. So this is attributed to colonialism, frankly. Slaves were brought here to till the land that was captured, and, indigenous people were completely removed from that land. So there's a lot of power in identifying Black and Indigenous people in saying the term BIPOC as opposed to just classifying everyone within people of color, because the specific relationship to nature that this country has stripped away from Black and Indigenous communities is just so, so significant. Some, I guess, literature around that is based on, there's a book called Sweetness and Power, which talks about the way in which the desire for sugarcane and the domestication of sugarcane kind of propelled the Atlantic slave trade and what we know today. And also just understanding that the agricultural knowledge that helped create this nation, that slaves contributed to this nation, was not something that they were taught. Africans came to this country understanding how to till the land and how to contribute and how to make this country what it is today, with very little recognition and just this very, very damaging narrative of this lack of understanding, this lack of awareness. Judith Carney is a big writer on Atlantic studies, and she has a paper called Agro-Environments and Slave Strategies in the Diffusion of Race Culture to the Americas. So that pretty much just talks about how in Africa there was a very, very robust understanding of agricultural knowledge, which contributed to why African slaves were brought to the United States. So that is kind of the baseline in which we enter this conversation, and understanding that, yeah, people of color, but specifically Black and Indigenous communities, have been, especially in the United States, completely isolated from our agricultural and environmental knowledge and our connection to the outdoor space.
Jerry, do you want to?
Yeah. So addressing the first part of the question, I don't really have a personal relationship with the environment per se. Growing up in Las Vegas, you know, I always just thought the surrounding area and the mountains were really beautiful and stuff, but it wasn't like a connection per se as you would like, you know, how indigenous people or Native Americans have a connection with their land and things like that. I have something I always just wanted to protect and thought it was beautiful and something to be preserved. And I think part of that reason is because of the effectiveness that like imperialism and colonialism have had on destroying BIPOC's connection with nature. I mean, if you look at going back from the start of this nation, for example, you know, Africans were taking from Africa their homeland, and the environment is so important because it impacts everything that we do, like how we live, where we work, we play, learn, where we worship. And so to forcibly remove someone from their environment, severing that connection, you know, has been the result of these activities. And that's why it's so important to reestablish that connection now, and you know, in these times. And we see it happening all over the world too. If you look at the Uyghur people in China, UIGHUR, you quickly look it up, or John Oliver recently did a segment on them in China. You know, they're not allowed to practice their culture at all. They're being sent to like re-education camps. You know, the Guyanese people who originally were from India aren't accepted in India anymore because they were removed by the English from their environment. And so like, it's so hard to connect with a place that you were forcibly put in, but doesn't mean it's impossible. But that's why it's more important now to reestablish those roots and get people in, you know, to these spaces, these green spaces or an environment. And you've seen the videos of people of color in the parks, and someone comes and threatens to call the cops on them just because they're barbecuing, and like, you know, the power that they know, the power that has of threatening to call the police on people of color, and that removes them from the space further where they weren't already accepted. And it's just one of the barriers to reestablishing that connection that was severed from the beginning.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the next question. What do you see as the connection between outdoor recreation and environmental justice? And Justin, I believe you're going to speak to this.
Yeah, sure. So basically what I wanted to say is that generally BIPOC have been excluded from places of outdoor recreation. And as someone that majored in an environmental studies degree, I studied wildlife biology, so I could kind of speak to this. Generally, I was one of maybe 6 or 7 other people of color in my degree, and because of that, we were incredibly underrepresented in these spaces. Even for me, there were some certain stereotypes as an East Asian man. There are certain stereotypes about me, about how I couldn't rough it out in the wilderness, or how I couldn't handle doing a chainsaw training or doing a wildlife fire training. So there are just certain stereotypes, and we see that even today. A few months ago, of course, with Christian Cooper, and that isn't just an isolated incident. I know many BIPOC birders, herpers, wildlife photographers that are generally scared about going out alone. They need to have a white friend go out with them, or sometimes they ask me to go out with them because they're scared about the assumptions being made when they are out in these outdoor spaces. And you see, I don't think it's a coincidence that many of outdoor recreation users tend to be older white males in the middle to upper class. So just that divide, you kind of see. And of course, as a wildlife biology major, I kind of saw that too. So I think it's important to recognize that, yes, there is this divide, and BIPOC are often excluded from these spaces, and to kind of change that. And things like proximity to outdoor spaces in urban areas, sometimes even park fees, continue to exclude those people from using outdoor recreation spaces. So I think that is something important to consider. Yeah.
Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, going off of what Justin has said, like, and also Ariel, like having the program that took inner city kids out to enjoy these, you know, the wilderness spaces was pretty great. But like, I personally didn't have that experience. Like, I honestly didn't even get out to the woods until I was maybe a sophomore in high school, because it was part of my environmental science like program. That was like the first time I'd ever been out there. Otherwise, I just lived in the desert kind of thing. And so like, there are these, you know, these barriers already in place for getting out to outdoor recreation, like skiing, hiking, all those kind of things. But I mean, if you also look at it, like, you know, where this Cancer Alley is called Cancer Alley for a reason, right? Like, where do you see the smokestacks? You know, are there access to parks nearby, or do people living around, like, you know, fenced in neighborhoods? Like, do they have, you know, these overburdened pollution threats near them? Like, how many ski trails or biking trails are near these communities of color or low-income communities, when it's already hard enough to get access to these places, or they don't have a mode of transportation to get to these places? And so you can see where the connection between outdoor recreation and environmental justice come into play, or they don't come into play, because there's hardly a connection there to begin with. And when we had all the candidates running, Democratic candidates running for president, a lot of them in their plans had access to parks, you know, as part of their environmental justice efforts. And so there's obviously a national recognition of the disconnect that exists between recreation and BIPOC communities.
I mean, can I just add to that a little bit? So I was really inspired with what Justin was saying about like environmental education and how it contributes to like very biased narratives and very white narratives. And I will never forget, I was in an environmental ethics class in college, and we were reading an article about the similarities between animal cruelty and American slavery. And like things like that, if no one else is there to challenge that type of conversation, that type of narrative, then people are gonna like actually believe that that's like valid, that like Black Americans in this country are compared in any way to animals. So, you know, it's things like that. And then also just speaking to Jerry's point, Robert Moses, a very well-known urban planner, was very intentional about keeping BIPOC communities out of outdoor spaces. For example, he designed a bridge that wouldn't allow public buses to be able to go through. It was so low that public buses could not go through to get to Jones Beach. So like, if you didn't have your own vehicle, then you literally could not have access to that beach. So it's something that is embedded very deep into the history of the United States, and it reverberates into like current culture. And it's also just something that happens internationally.
Thanks for adding that. Next question. Okay, how have racist policies and law, businesses, and similar led to environmental destruction disproportionately impacting BIPOC and the financially disadvantaged? And Jameson, I think you're first.
Yeah. So the truth of the matter is, when it comes to a topic of this nature, this could be a webinar on its own. And each law and policy that we can speak of could also be its own webinar of its own. So what I'll do is I'll do my best for the time that I have just to highlight a few and to cover different areas, simply because this is also a good kind of part to talk about the intersectionality of environmental justice and the issues that BIPOC communities and individuals face. So we'll start off with like unincorporated communities, you know, Foreman Freeman towns, which now unfortunately, you know, may or may not have the proper sanitation and basic, you know, things that we take for granted being an incorporated community. due to the fact that they cannot be annexed in. The procedures and the processes that allow for these unincorporated communities to become incorporated are ones that are designed not to have Black communities become incorporated and be annexed in, leading them to have issues with, like I said, clean water, with sewage, lead, basic things that we take for granted, like street lights, the ability to vote at local elections, so many different trickle-down effects that come with being unincorporated that specifically put these communities at risk and at a much lower social economic status, which also then plays a part into their role in terms of not having political clout when it comes time to fight for their rights against corporations that create byproduct that is toxic, that ends up in the same neighborhood. Farming is another intersect of environmental justice in the fact that land theft has been rapid. People of color now, Black people in particular, have less land than they did 100 years ago. And that is not by accident. There are laws in place and there are things in place that have been taken advantage. And the lack of understanding of law plays a huge part of that, the lack of understanding of rules and how things work within that realm. Banking is a huge part of where we have lost a lot of economic and financial ground. Freedmen, there was a Freedmen Savings Bank at one point that had over $75 million deposited by all different Black owners, individuals, only for that bank to not then return and give out any loans to the same people that funded them because it was white ran. Not long after that bank ended up closing and everybody lost their money. So people who were able to garner some type of economic increase instantly lost it by doing the right thing and in terms of placing their money in what they thought was a safe situation. The New Deal signed by President Roosevelt is another example, which created a boom of credit unions and banks, only for those credit unions and banks, again, to find a way to leave Black people out. Mortgage discrimination is another thing. Currently right now, there's 19 banks only that are Black owned compared to the hundreds, if not thousands, that are white owned. I haven't even got to real estate yet, redlining. We all know about that, huge issue. Deed restrictions, something that people don't know a lot about, and the fact that there are certain areas where deed restrictions legally have prevented people of color from being able to purchase in certain areas. Most recently, two days ago, I believe, which is happening like right now, which is what I really want to focus on and let people know that we're talking about these laws and these issues that might seem so far, away. It's not. It's modern. It's happening right now. Just 2 days ago, the Trump administration repealed the affirmative furthering fair housing rule, which was an Obama administration rule that really emphasized and tried to protect what it was that the Fair Housing Act was supposed to do in terms of including people of color. It required local governments who were receiving funds to develop and account for biased practices and to craft things to fix those issues within their practices, only for the president to send out a tweet saying something along the lines of, suburbia is now safe because there's not going to be any more low-income housing, any more crime, which if you read it between the lines, which is pretty easy, meaning there's no more Black people going to be in suburbia. So again, these are just four of many that I have time to address right now, but there are a number of systemic and institutionalized racist policies, laws that continue to separate us and not allow BIPOC individuals to gain any type of economic wealth or put them in a position where they could be in executive management positions within businesses, board of directors positions. I mean, the list goes on, but again, this is just a few.
Gary?
Yeah, to go off that housing thing, like Jameson, and BIPOC people, not having ownership of their land, especially with COVID happening, the temporary stop on paying rent only applies to the homeowners. It didn't protect renters, and so people of color who didn't own their homes weren't protected, and so they still were forced to pay rent, even though they had lost their jobs or had no means to pay rent themselves, and so they were like forced out of their home still. in this pandemic situation we're having. So that's one of the recent examples that you can see where BIPOC people are disproportionately affected by the laws put in place in this country. Another one is the marijuana industry. There's such a high market barrier to entry for people of color. Obtaining a license and to grow weed legally requires applicants to have so much money in the bank. One state requires that you have $500,000 in your bank account at that time, or just filling out the paperwork and taxes can be upwards of $750,000 to $1 million. And so it really only opens the door for multinational, like multi-billion-dollar companies to come in and capitalize on this industry that's expected to make like $287 billion, and it leaves out people of color who want to access this industry, and they can't because of the laws that the states have put in place to basically keep them out. And it's pretty evident that they're typed out on purpose by these hard to entry barriers.
Yeah. If I just may add as well, and to Jerry's point again, I mean, I think we pretty much create the marijuana industry through underground and through, what we had to do to survive in sense of that. But in terms of, I don't want to forget about including Black law, Black codes, and the importance of unrecognizing just what those laws have done generationally to BIPOC community. Black codes and Jim Crow laws have set us back and done things in terms of separation that has taken the years since its removal and even farther for us to close that gap just a little bit, but then you have mass incarceration, which obviously took over. And then you have, the death penalty, which took over for lynching. So all of these things are racist laws, prejudice laws, discriminatory laws that have been designed specifically to keep Black out and separated.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to the next question. How do we create anti-racist policies to remedy the impacts of racist policies? Ariel?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for a very long time talking about anti-racist policies and what they look like. Jameson and I have co-authored an anti-racism policy for school districts and organizations, and we're collaborating with quite a few of them right now in order to get them adopted and figure out what specific organizations or school districts need in order to combat racism within their systems. But within this environmental space, we need to first acknowledge and recognize environmental racism and make big green organizations and green spaces more accessible for BIPOC communities. That is first and foremost. There have been articles coming out for recently talking about the very racist, overt racist like ideologies that a lot of the founders of a lot of the big greens had, which excluded a lot of BIPOC community members from even getting involved in the movement. Justin mentioned the cost barrier for access to a lot of the national parks and things of that nature. So that is, I think, one of the first steps we need to address. Second is opposing racist ideologies that currently exist within the environmental space. So that kind of speaks to exactly what I have just been talking about and what all of my panelists have been referring to and acknowledging. We also need to create procedures that ensure that BIPOC individuals who want to take part in these organizations or just take up space in the outdoors have a way to do so and to report racist acts where the perpetrator is actually held accountable for their actions. What happened to Mr. Cooper in New York City just should not occur. Like, he literally told this woman to leash her dog in an area that had signs everywhere that said leash your dog. Like, he was doing absolutely nothing wrong. He was simply existing outdoors, and his life was threatened because she felt like she had more of a right to the outdoor space than he did. So there needs to be ways for people to be held accountable for that type of behavior, because that's unacceptable. And finally, and this is just a few of many, just decreasing some of the limitations that hinder BIPOC communities from gaining access. So whether that means increasing transportation to go directly to public to national parks and state parks and just green spaces in general. Again, lowering that financial burden, figuring out ways to make sure that the outdoors are as accessible as possible to BIPOC communities.
Jerry?
I saw a question. What does the green communities are big green means? I just want to address that really fast. It's just me, the big organizations out there like Sierra Club, NRDC, Wildlife Conservation Society, Audubon Society, Friends of the Earth. Like it means those kind of things. But in terms of creating anti-racist policies, I think there first needs to be a recognition of that there are racist policies in place, because I think a lot of the times there's a kind of a denial and disbelief in it, that there are still people who think they can see all races the same way when we talk about the environment. But that's not the case at all. Some communities just happen to have the wrong complexion for protection. And so I mean, the biggest hurdle is obviously to convince policy and decision makers that everyone has a right to live in the environment where laws are applied equally across the board. And a lot of people who the reality is the vast majority of the population doesn't live near chemical plants or on the fence line of dangerous places, so they don't often believe that when communities point it out. It's kind of like how climate change in the beginning, or at least maybe even sometimes today, people are like, oh, it's not happening to me, so it's not happening at all. And that's kind of the mentality that goes forward with, these racist policies and environmental justice and dismantling them. And that's why I think grassroots or protest works so well, because people are like, where's it at? We don't see anyone. And these protests are like, yay, here we are, this is the response to it. And we need to change the policies that are clearly affecting the neighborhoods and have a detrimental impact on their health and their way of life. And so I think the first step is acknowledge that these policies are in place and then dismantling them from there. Like, I mean, just after these past few months, Mississippi declared like April to be their Confederate Heritage Month. Like, that's insane. Like, they just also took down their the flag for that have the Confederate flag on it, on their state flag. Like, that's insane. We're in 2020 and this is now just happening right now. And so there are still so many anti-racist or racist policies that are in place that we need to acknowledge and then take down from there. There needs to be meaningful engagement with the people of color in these communities who are affected by these policies.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, next question. How is the environmental movement excluded BIPOC and centered on whiteness? And Justin, you're going to speak to this.
Yeah, so this is something I could talk about for a long time, but even historically, the environmental movement has kind of centered around whiteness. You look at some of the major historical figures in the environmental movement, like Thoreau, Muir, Madison Grant. They've all kind of had, although they were influential in starting this environmental movement, they had really problematic and racist past. For instance, Madison Grant was in favor of eugenics and was in favor of the Immigration Act, which excluded immigration from East Asian countries. Henry David Thoreau and Muir had kind of this very problematic view of wilderness and how wilderness was supposed to be untouched by man, even though that view kind of ignored the thousands and thousands of years of management by tribes. Even during the formation of the national park system started with many of these parks being segregated. And we even see parts of this now. I mean, I talked about before how many of the recreation users are majority white, majority male. And you look at some of the really famous environmental nonprofits, and I think a study was just done that maybe 10, 11% of people working in environmental nonprofits were BIPOC. And you see that, yeah, you also see in the climate change movement, it's very centered around kind of an individualistic sense. So it's known that corporations, companies contribute 70% of 60 to 70% of greenhouse gases, yet we're in a sense right now that we like to blame individuals, usually people that can't afford buying green products, which happen to be people of lower income. So we're almost shaming these people that can't do anything about it. So, and even today we see much of the most popular climate change advocates are white. There's not a lot of propping up BIPOC climate change advocates. So in that way, I think the environmental movement has kind of focused on whiteness rather than kind of propping up people that have really, BIPOC that have really shaped the environmental movement. Like Shenandoah National Park, many people might not know this, but Shenandoah started because of a Black man that owned that land and sold it to the national park system. We wouldn't have Shenandoah without that man. So those are kind of my thoughts on that question.
Jerry?
Mariah, if I may, there's a question in there that Ms. McGinnis put in about ways to attract the young BIPOC communities in Vermont. And so I just want to address that. That's okay.
We can answer questions at the end if you prefer.
Okay, whatever's best for you.
Okay, we'll do it at the end, which is in a couple more questions. So I'm going to go ahead and let Jerry.
Yeah, I mean, going off of what Justin said, and I saw someone in the chat also posted it too, but yeah, recently Sierra Club just, you know, it's reeling with its own white supremacist history with John Muir, and like, you know, how he disparaged African Americans and Native Americans. But yeah, you see a lot of these groups now are dealing with their history and their founders. And, you know, like, if you look at that, like, who comprises their board, you know, and if you even see like movies depicting things like, there was one that recently came out about the DuPont one, or maybe it's coming out about DuPont story, or even if you hear about Flint, Michigan, you know, how many of them talk about the people of color that actually help these efforts move forward before, you know, these white saviors, lawyers, or whoever came in to take over the case. Like, you know, that's all you hear about afterward is the people who came in to take over the case, not the people on the ground who were being affected by it, who took their own, you know, data and sent it places and got the word out, were on the ground, going door to door. You know, you don't hear about those kind of things. And only now, like, NRDC is, they just hired Troy Riddle, who is now going to implement anti-racist policies within the organization. And so now you see this kind of like emerging space for BIPOC people, and I think it's a great step, right? Don't get me wrong, it's a good first step, but there's still ways to go. And I think it's only happening because of the situation we're in now nationally, not because they realize, oh, hey, there's no people of color around us, like, we should fix this. Like, no, it's more of the pressure of society to do this and to fix the image, which is, like, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but I wouldn't say it's from their own initiatives. And then also you had that picture of Greta Thunberg, and that had edited out the Black woman. And, you know, that's, again, it's just centering the environmental movement on whiteness. And then, yeah, I've always said too, the environmental movement is inherently anthropocentric and focuses on people. But the thing is, it's which people does it focus on? You're protecting the health and, you know, human environment and the quality of lives, but of mainly white people, where all these other facilities and places are getting put in BIPOC communities where they have no power, or political power to do anything about them. And so even the laws we have to protect people don't always protect the people.
Yeah, so
Sorry, go
if I
ahead.
could build off that just a little bit, Jerry.
Go ahead.
I definitely was hoping you were going to kind of end at that point, because unequal enforcement is humongous in terms of, we have these environmental laws set in place. The EPA is, denying complaints at a 95% clip, in terms of only 5% of all the complaints are actually getting some type of traction in terms of being looked at through the EPA. And that is, the federal government agency that is really designed and in place to offer some type of protection, especially for low-income individuals. So yeah, I definitely just wanted to kind of emphasize the unequal enforcements and how that's played a role in part.
And I just wanted to add, also piggybacking on what Jerry said, just acknowledging that like this moment seems to be like the reason why a lot of the big green groups are acknowledging their like very racist histories. Like it is not like uncommon. It's not a hidden fact that John Muir was a very racist person. Like it's not something that like we just discovered this summer. And I think the timing of that article was just very, very fascinating. And I'll leave that at that. And also, yeah, just speaking to the importance of citizen science and the recognition that communities who are dealing with a lot of these issues are experts and had to become experts in order to figure out what's happening, because the government wasn't paying them any attention, scientists weren't paying them attention, the environmentalists were definitely not paying them any attention. And so these BIPOC communities who are facing the greatest amount of environmental harm, especially understanding that race is the #1 indicator of the siting of toxic facilities anyway, especially in the United States. Yeah, like there needs to be a greater acknowledgement of citizen science and the ways in which we interact with community members who have been doing this work, the people who have been collecting the data, like testing and being the brunt of all of this environmental harm for the benefit of people who have the political wherewithal, who have the money, who have the connections with government to be able to say, no, I don't want that in my space, and it's just, yeah, and I'll stop there and I'll let somebody else answer. We can ask the next question.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question then. Okay, so how are the BLM movement and environmental movements connected? What parallels do you see in the demands of the BLM movement and the environmental movement? And Ariel, you're up.
All right, I'm back. So I think, I mean, first, like even the fact that we have to like separate them out as if like the Black Lives Matter movement and like the climate justice movement aren't correlated is a form of privilege. Like to not have to think about one because you're prioritizing the other is a privilege and a luxury that I, as a Black woman, just don't have. And so a very poignant quote that Toni Morrison once said is, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you from explaining. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And, especially in this moment right now where Black Lives Matter is at the forefront of the national attention, like a lot of Black people have had to shift their focus from whatever else they're doing in their lives to do advocacy, educational work, to be able to not only like check on their fellow Black people to make sure that we're like doing okay, but also educating white people on like why they should care, which like, again, is just so baffling to me that we even have to tell people why they should care about Black Lives Matter. And so there is also this movement happening associated with something called intersectional environmentalism. So it's been coined by this woman named Leah Thomas, and it's been like, exploding this summer. She put out an article and like posted something on Instagram that was like very accessible to people, and it like caught on like wildfire. And so people are now finally recognizing that like in order to be an environmentalist and care about this earth and this planet, then you need to work extra hard to advocate for the people who have been dealing with environmental harm in their spaces for decades, for centuries. So that's the one thing. Like, you can't care about the environment without caring about the Black lives harmed by unequal distribution of environmental hazards. It just can't happen. You can't have, and you can't even care about racial justice without caring. You can't care about climate justice without caring about racial justice. Racism hinders productivity. And so we're in a moment right now where, yeah, we should be advocating for climate justice, but like, guess what? There are so many racist people in this world that feel so inclined to like spew their hate and spew their racist ideologies and, you know, contribute to actions that are affecting BIPOC communities that we have to pause on the issue of climate justice and addressing the climate issue in order to teach people why being racist is bad. And so, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement advocates for the rights and protections of Black lives. Since we are being systematically and systemically targeted and killed, it advocates for freedom and liberation and justice. The environmental movement advocates for the preservation, restoration, and improvement of the natural environment to establish and maintain freedom and liberation and attain justice. Justice was in both of those definitions. And, you know, you can't advocate for not polluting the environment without advocating on behalf of those most harmed by pollution. Climate change is a human-made action. It's something that is happening as a result of human action. And so we need as many humans as possible to help fight this thing that is threatening our lives, that is threatening our world, literally. And so, you know, we need to protect the Black lives that are being targeted and killed in order for us to be able to evolve and contribute to this movement in meaningful ways.
Gary?
Yeah, great point what Ariel said. I mean, everything she said, double that. But yeah, I mean, they aren't separable. To talk about the environment, it means you have to talk about race and the Black Lives movement. You know, both things. One thing that they have in common is that they both came out of the communities, not the government themselves, but the communities who were affected by it. You know, the ones who struggled for justice, where these movements came from. And race is so intertwined in our society, and it's a difficult topic to talk about, sure, but you can't talk about one without having to address the other. You know, America is segregated, and so is pollution. We try to, you know, unpack that. Like, people are like, oh no, it just goes for like poverty or whatever. Like, no, that's wrong. Like, it goes with race. Like, people who get dumped on, it's because of the color of their skin. You know, racism is such an overarching aspect in the U.S. But they're one and the same. Like, they're intertwined, and you have to deal with that together. And I mean, like I said, the environmental movement is anthropocentric and it protects people, but we need to shift our frame of mind to actually protecting people who are most affected and most vulnerable by this. You know, the courts even have reduced the effectiveness of laws. If you look at NEPA, it should have been this like grandiose thing that was supposed to stop basically facilities going in, or like pipelines, or, you know, all these things. It's supposed to protect people, but no, the courts have reduced it to an entirely procedural statute. And so, like, the laws that were meant to safeguard people's health don't even do that because they've been so diminished and chipped away at it. And nothing's been done since the 70s or 1990s, if you take into account the amendments. Like, we're using archaic laws to try and address the problems we have today, and that's not going to work. And the Black Lives Matter movement is speaking out against, like, hey, we're still here, we still matter, and it's a problem and it needs to be addressed.
Does anyone have anything to add? Okay, we'll move on to the next question. I think we're on 7, not 8. Thank you. Why is it important for people to see the connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and the environmental movement? And Jameson?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, for us to be successful and understand this question, we have to end the conversation of the environmental movement as a whole, right? As we talked about for the last 6 questions, the foundation of the environmental movement that we are witnessing and part of today in terms of the big greens is embedded in elite conservancy, eugenics. We talked about John Muir, I mean, etc. It really just goes on. The colonization version of like the environmental movement that we're dealing with today is strictly funded by wealthy white people. You know, it takes place in courts. It takes place in congressional lobby halls. This is where the environmental movement has shifted to. You know, it's so exclusive that you have to be in these realms in which are so hard for people of color to get to. For years, the same environmental organizations that we have, you know, uplifted and praised for their, you know, conservation and their wildlife work have also perpetuated white supremacy and white privilege, simply by ignoring the fact that the burdens that are being placed in terms of having electricity and energy and things of that nature are on the Black community. And if you're, you know, got your head in the sand and ignoring those things, then you're doing nothing more than just perpetuating white supremacy and white superiority, just as somebody who was vocally out there doing the same thing. If you want to find pollution today, it's pretty simple. It's very simple. At the federal level, at the local level, at the state level, in your neighborhood. If you want to find pollution, you find the Black people. If you find Black people, you find the pollution. That should not be the case. As Ariel has said so elegantly earlier, there is no climate justice without environmental justice, without racial justice, without social justice. You know, because the thing about it is that the original environmentalists were embedded in the social movement. You know, I mean, that starts with the natives and their fight for their lands and their rights to protect their lands and their sacred grounds. And that, you know, moved on to the 1960s and the civil rights movement. And, you know, the really kind of first time that the environmental justice was out there when the sanitation strike occurred. And that was the last time Martin Luther King spoke before he was assassinated the day after he spoke. All the way up into the 80s when we finally started to kind of pull back, you know, the smoke screen that was in front of us in terms of the big greens, that the elitism that exists within these big greens is real. You know, the lack of diversity in executive management positions, the lack of diversity in the organization itself. The Black Lives Matter movement, what it really does is that it emphasizes the ways in which Black lives are at risk, are in danger. You know, it finally gives space for conversations to happen around the ways that environment and environmental justice intersect. You know, while the police may or may not have been the focal point in the beginning and still are, obviously, for rightfully so reasons, we also have to understand that there are other ways that we can combat things like the chokehold. I mean, I've said this pretty much all summer in the times that I've talked, but I will keep saying it because people need to understand, to be honest with you, that chokeholds are not always physical. They're not. It doesn't take your hands wrapped around my Black neck to choke me out. Okay, chokeholds happen, as we talked about earlier, with unequal enforcement. You know, chokeholds happen with the unequal distribution of wealth among environmental organizations. You know, the chokehold happens when there's unequal representation of BIPOC individuals in executive spaces. These are all versions and forms of chokehold. These are all reasons why the Black Lives Matter movement has really sparked and been a catalyst for so many other intersectional conversations, you know, and it needs to continue. It cannot stop, and it won't stop until we find a way that we don't need to have the same conversation over and over again.
Absolutely. Okay, last question. How can allies support BIPOC and initiatives such as economic security, affordable childcare, health issues, and other challenges that result from racist policies? Jameson, last question is yours.
All right, man. It's a loaded question. There's so many different ways, right? There's a lot of different ways. Redistribution of wealth. I'm big on that. I'm big on redistribution of wealth, the redistribution of land. You know, we were promised something, 40 acres and a mule. The federal government promised that to us. We never received that. As I said, we now have less land than we did 100 years ago. There are certain property practices that are happening all over Southern America that are taking land away from individuals without even their knowledge. There's so many things happening. It's pretty ridiculous. But you know, eliminating all internal processes and procedures that perpetuate white supremacy and the systemic and institutionalized racism within your organization. You know, what's happening right now is there's a lot of companies releasing statements, saying all the right things, but they're not doing anything internally to back that up. You know, everybody's kind of doing the Aunt Jemima thing, which is getting rid of the image, but the ingredients that are making people sick are the exact same. You know, and so if you're going to release a statement and you're going to claim to be a part of this movement and be a part of you know, the way the culture is shifting in terms of actually having all lives matter through Black Lives Mattering, then the internal process and internal procedures need to change with whatever your message that you're putting out there to the world. If a month to 6 months to a year after you release the statement, you look at your executive board or you look at those that you're working with and it's still white as snow, then you have a problem. At that point, it was lip service. BIPOC individuals need to be in executive roles. We need to be in the board of directors meetings because that's where the decisions are made. You know, it's a room for 6 or 7 people that are making a decision for an entire community and what that community's culture will be in the future. We need to compensate Black people and BIPOC people, individuals, for the time in educating non-BIPOC individuals. Like if we're gonna, as Ariel said earlier, stop what we have been focusing on in terms of, you know, climate change and anti-racism and the things that we deem important for ourselves and for our community, to stop all that, to then educate white individuals and not be compensated for that is another issue. You got to remove the limits in real estate. You know, there's so many hurdles and so many unspoken practices that happen within real estate that we need to eliminate. Voter suppression. I'm sorry, you got me going. So if you know, I'm going. So you know, voter suppression, you know, is another one. Like we talk about that and what's happening in Kentucky just a couple months ago. We you know, what's going on all over the country, really, in terms of especially those that needing certain type of identity, you know, eliminating those who have been incarcerated. These are all tactics that aren't anything new, but we have been okay with it for so many years, and that's unacceptable. I need white people to use their political clout for the BIPOC community. If you're serious about what you say you are, if you're serious about being part of this movement, making this life better, if you have political clout, meaning pretty much you live in a white community that is middle class or above, I need you to use that clout for people other than yourselves. Clean energy, sustainable living. We need job trainings for BIPOC individuals. Now that's an area that's booming. You know, if you're somebody that works in that field, find the Black experts because they're out there. They're absolutely out there. I'm big on the federal government paying for Black Americans to have a DNA test to find out what their tribe is in Africa, and then paying for their birthright trip. Because the thing about it is that, you know, when the World Cup comes around, everybody's, you know, proud to be Italian and proud to be German and proud to be Greek and proud to be all these, you know, different amazing countries. When it comes to me, I can go far back as North Carolina. So I may not have, you know, pride in the Ivory Coast like I should if I'm from the Ivory Coast or Nigeria or South Africa or whatever the case may be. These are all things that, again, are just intersectional ways or intersections, I should say, that cross over with environmental justice, that cross over with all the racial and social justice issues that we continue to have on a daily basis. And those are just a few of the ways that allies can support. And I can keep going, but I won't.
And before we open it up, no, Jerry, you go. You go. Well, okay. Well, I was just going to read a quote from a book. So the book is called Afroism, and it's essays on pop culture, feminism, and Black veganism from two sisters. And yeah, I guess like as environmentalists, we are activists. And so this chapter just talks about why confusion is necessary for our activism to evolve. So I just wanted to read a very quick excerpt from it, and then Jerry will say things, and then Mariah's gonna open it up to questions for the public. So, part of activism is finding yourself in a new space of confusion, allowing yourself to step into new conceptual terrain. When you abandon commonly held oppressive beliefs, you might not exactly know what to do afterward, but that's where more activism needs to be. Confusion is usually a symptom of decolonizing yourself from the mainstream system. Answers aren't easily laid out in front of you since you're now forced to think critically. You have to create new blueprints and imagine new ways of interacting with people and doing things. And that's that on that.
Yeah, nice. And then Jameson also great as well, amazing. But yeah, I mean, going off of the using political clout, this morning I was watching Trevor Noah, and he had comparisons between 2014 when Clyde Bundy, the white rancher who trespassed on federal land, and then when President Obama sent in federal agents to stop him, all the news shows were like, this is tyranny. Now President Trump went on air saying that he went too far, this is too much. And then contrasting to today about sending federal agents in the Black Lives Matter movements and like picking people up in cars, they're like, oh, this is totally fine, it's patriotic, like what the people are doing on the streets is terrible. And like you just see this like racist rhetoric, and it's like so stark when you put them together side by side. And it's like, how is this the state we're in? Like we need people with political clout to stop this. And one of the things I was most triggered by is Supreme Court denied the review of qualified immunity for police officers. They could have changed the whole field, could have erased qualified immunity that gets so many police off for killing young Black people. Because what the thing says, it has to be on point. If the facts aren't exact, like to the T, then the whole case is thrown out and the police get to walk. And this is a judge-made rule. This isn't in statutes or anything, so it doesn't take a huge time in Congress or things to overrule this. Like this is judge-made rule, and they could have changed that. And states can still change that themselves. The states have the power to do that. And so, you know, I encourage everyone with political clout to go and do something about everything.
I'd like to add something too. I think while we were talking, it made me think of something, but I think even when I was going through my undergrad in wildlife biology, it's easy to look at the environmental field and just think, wow, everyone's liberal here, or everyone is a Democrat, to just kind of be complacent in a way, and to kind of feel like, oh, we are making progress just by our political affiliation. But I urge you to all rethink that and just say, actually, we need to be making more of an active approach, even though we all, or most of us, align very similarly politically. And even to those people that say, well, I don't want to politicize my outdoor space. I don't think hiking or birding should be politicized. I challenge you to take any hobby that you have and just type into Google history of blank. I did it myself a couple of weeks ago. Even when I did something like history of knitting, everything has been politicized. And I think it's important to recognize that, and to recognize that even the environmental movement is, or just going outside and hiking is highly politicized, and just to recognize that.
Okay, I want to thank all of you again. As Ariel and Jameson both said, it shouldn't be your responsibility to educate everybody else. And so we really do appreciate the fact that you've volunteered your time and your experience and your intellect. And I'm just absolutely inspired. So we're now going to move to questions from the audience. Going to begin, and Lauren and I are both going to be pitching these. So some of them are for particular people, but the rest, anybody can jump in. So the first one is from Linda. What are ways in Vermont to attract young BIPOC communities, both those in Vermont and those elsewhere, to outdoor programs like the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps? And what factors would make them more attractive? Anyone can jump in.
Oh, you can go first, Jameson.
No. Okay, sure.
Okay.
So what I'll say is we can sit here and we can give you a list of things to do. But what I would like to do is I would like to ask you a question in terms of, is your program ready for BIPOC individuals to be in that space, right? Because if you aren't aware, there have been times where BIPOC community members have come up from different areas of the country, New Haven, Connecticut, Massachusetts, all over the world, only to get here and then be ostracized and be thrown racist everything, to be honest with you. You know, there's stories about Black students who went up to Stowe and were harassed the entire time. I unfortunately have heard stories about people coming to the town of Hartford. You know, there's been stories about, especially, you know, with COVID, people who have been living here but might have a license plate from where they lived previously, especially Black people, people of color, have, you know, really been targeted. One thing I always challenge Vermont towns and people who live in Vermont towns and cities is that they are quick to claim the progressive nature in which that they live in. But I really want to make sure you understand what that means. And I really want to make sure you know what you're doing when you're inviting BIPOC individuals to your community, because you only get a first shot for impression, and you only get a first shot if you're a Black person for comfortability. So if I come up to Vermont and then I have a terrible experience in Vermont, then my entire Vermont experience is no longer something that I want to pursue. It's not just your community, it's not just your area. So can I give you things to get people of color come up here? Maybe, maybe not, maybe so, because another thing is that I'm not a representative of all Black people. So what might get me here might not do something for somebody else. So, you know, only thing I really could say with that, I guess, is just be creative, find the people of color within your community, have them, pay them to help you figure that out. If you're looking for a certain demographic, find somebody of color within that demographic and pay them to help you out. But before you do any of that, I really, really, really just want you to make sure that your community is ready for that and ready for what it means to have people of color in your space or in the world space, because it's not your space.
Yeah, everything that Jameson said was awesome. And I think I saw a lot of questions that had the same type of theme, like how do I include BIPOC in my outdoors recreation or outdoor space, or how do we get more BIPOC into wildlife or nature careers? And I was reading this article recently that had a couple ideas of how to do that I think were pretty good. I think first would be just including them in the history of the environmental movement. So like I explained before, the environmental movement has been really centered on whiteness. So including people like the history of Shenandoah Park, like I mentioned before, including people like that into your conversation would include more people. Also, things like, I saw this great campaign for kind of changing the uniforms for park rangers. For anyone that asks that question, I don't know if your outdoor spaces have park rangers or naturalists or something like that, but I was a park ranger for about half a year. And the number one comment I would get when I would wear my uniform was, people would say, "You look like a cop." And I'm like, well, you're not wrong. I do kind of look like a cop. So in the UK, there's a huge thing to change the uniform for naturalists and park rangers. And you could look it up if you just look up UK park rangers, but Patagonia sponsored it. And their uniforms in the UK look much sleeker, much more inviting. Because obviously, for anyone, if you see a cop, you're going to be very apprehensive. You're going to be nervous, and people have certain stereotypes about park rangers, even though they're not technically law enforcement. So changing those costumes, or not costumes, but changing the uniforms for naturalists and park rangers, I think is a great way. And lastly, I remember when I was in college, I spoke to a high school class in Gary, Indiana. And for people that don't live in the Midwest, Gary, Indiana is majority BIPOC community. So I spoke to those people and told them about kind of what I was doing in my undergrad, different careers in the environmental space. So I think that's really important. One of the people I was with, Megan Gunn, she has a great initiative at Purdue University in Indiana, Instagram at the Familiar Faces Project, where she basically talks to people in BIPOC communities about environmental jobs. And people are more likely to go to those jobs if they see people that look like them. And I think that's really important. So just highlighting the diversity you might have in a certain nonprofit or a government environmental organization is a really great way. And I had so many questions kind of funneling in from those kids in Gary, and it was really inspiring. And it was one of my favorite parts of undergrad, just talking to those kids about environmental careers. So something like that would be awesome. And that's all I have.
Just to add, Jerry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, going off what Justin was saying, I think it's important to reestablish that connection, letting BIPOC people know that there is a space for them. There has been a space for them. Like if I remember reading this Times article back a few months ago that there were black cowboys. Like what? Like, I mean, you never hear about that. Like, and so like black people don't grow up and like, oh, I want to be a cowboy, because they don't see that. And so same in the environmental movement or like in these conservation groups, you don't see that, but there are spaces for people. So like Dr. Robert Bullard, who's known as like the father of environmental justice movement, like, he's in this. Solomon G. Brown was one of the first African-American employees at the Smithsonian Institute. I mean, there's so many people of color in the conservation and environmental field. And the fact that people of color don't get to see themselves reflected in, these people who are already in these fields might deter them from already walking into these spaces. So like reestablishing that connection of like, this is space where you can be yourself, where you can grow. There are already people of color who are doing what you want to do, and this isn't like a fruitless effort. There is a space for you. Like, we need to make that really known that it's an open field and that people of color are already doing this, and show people of color that, there are examples that they can look to. And so I think that's important of getting people to come in.
Ariel, were you about to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was. So thank you. Yeah, I think just adding on to that, like just when thinking about the reconnections with nature, like making it as accessible as possible, but like making it as, I guess, open as possible and including so many different sectors. So like, for example, like interactions with animals. Like I know a lot of kids in my community aren't comfortable around dogs because of a whole bunch of different reasons, but it's like lack of familiarity, lack of association, and the fact that dogs were literally weaponized and like were used as like an addition, an extension of slave catching. And so there's a lot of generational trauma going into like that association. So just recognizing those things and then just like helping to address them, like starting at a very young age, to make people, especially students, as they're growing up and, in becoming more involved in the environmental space, know that they are welcome and that there are ways to combat like some of that trauma.
If I could just really quick emphasize something that Jerry spoke about, which is the importance of representation, especially for the environmental organizations or the programs that do work within the environment. One of my first experiences working, I had opportunity to go to the headquarters of my job, and they gave us a tour. And what people don't realize is that when you're a person of color, you're always looking for somebody who looks like you, no matter where they are in the building or who they are in the building, whether they're a janitor, whether they're executive, you're looking for somebody who looks like you. And so I got a tour of this entire facility, which was a campus, probably about 5 to 8 square miles with 8-story buildings all over the place. And I could not find one single person of color. And I knew at that moment, before I even finished the tour, I was not going to be with that company much longer, because there was an opportunity for me there. I didn't see anybody there that could show me that, oh, you know what, I can actually move up and maybe get to this point of my career and be on the campus of the headquarters. So whether you realize it or not, I mean, I visited Hartford High School a couple of times for meetings as a select board member, and I hear the students of color running up behind me being like, oh my God, who's that? He's cool, he's cool. They don't even know who I am, but it's just the fact that somebody looks like them is in the building. I cannot stress how important that is. I'm somebody that went to an all-white school up until being in middle school, you know? And so I'm sitting in class, and I'm sure, you know, for those who have similar experiences, you probably have the same, where you're asked to talk about Kwanzaa at 8 years old when you yourself are still trying to learn it, you know, and different things of that nature. So representation in your organizations is key. And if you want to bring in, you know, individuals to experience what it is that your organization offers, you're going to have to find ways to have people that look like them be a part of your organization. And so I just really wanted to emphasize that, because that's something that just can't be brushed over, is that representation, whether it's on a TV screen, whether it's on movies, whether it's in cartoons, regardless of what it is, if it's in person, it has to be accurate and it has to matter.
Hey everyone, would you like to transition to the next question? Betsy Hands asks, thanks for sharing your experience with us. Lots of outdoor places, programs, and stewardship groups are led and organized by white-led, place-based nonprofits, especially in Vermont. In what ways are well-meaning, traditional, and community engagement efforts racist? What would a more anti-racist green nonprofit sector look like?
I'll take a stab. Diversity. I know it's hard in Vermont. I know it is. Maybe you be creative. You know, think outside the box. Maybe you open up a one seat of a board for somebody of color who may have spent time in Vermont, who might not live in Vermont, if you're having trouble finding somebody in Vermont. But I say that reluctantly because there are enough Black people in Vermont. You don't need to go outside of Vermont to find them. They're here, right here in Vermont. So it's really just a matter of how uncomfortable are you willing to be. You know, are you willing to go into communities and the areas that you have never been before? Are you willing to attend meetings that you have never been before, but you know Black people are going to be at? You know, are you only looking on listservs that are predominantly white? You know, how are you communicating with people who don't look like you? You know, I used to ask all of my constituents when I was a select board member, after I spoke with them, when was the last time they spoke with somebody of color that wasn't serving them something or doing something for them? And the answers that I would get were 6 months ago, 3 months ago, because I was in college, never. You know, and so ask your board members and ask your employees that same question, and find out kind of where you are on the spectrum when it really comes to racist and anti-racist. Because the thing about it is that there's a lot of people in Vermont that think they're not racist or think they're allies until they get in a situation with somebody of color, and then they realize that, oh, I didn't know I had that in me, or that's not who I am, or whatever excuse that they feel they can come up with to justify their action, right? So I tell people this might be a little harsh or whatnot, but if it took the murders that happened and the uprising for you to be an ally, you're not an ally. You're becoming an ally. You're doing the things to get there, but you're not there because it took the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and Rayshard Brooks and countless others for you to even think about coming to the conversation. And if those deaths didn't happen in the time frame that they happened so rapidly, would you be having this conversation with us right now? Would you be on this webinar? You know, are you holding people next to you accountable when they're making their implicit bias jokes and their racist jokes and all of those things? You know, are you willing to lose some friends? You know, I'm off my soapbox. Sorry.
Does anyone else have some thoughts to add on that question?
I just want to add to Jameson's, talking to people that might be BIPOC in your community or organization or place of work. Just know that it might be tiring for them to constantly speak on behalf of all BIPOC. I know when I was a tour guide in college, like I was pretty much the only non-white person. So it got tiring to speak for a lot of people. So just if you're asking someone to speak on diversity issues or be on a diversity board, think about the fatigue they might be going through and maybe pay them a little extra or give them more paid time off or something like that. That's all I have to add.
One thing about going off of that, I think that's one of the reasons why implicit bias training is so important. I know the Supreme Court in North Carolina is administering amongst all of their judges and justices and their employees it's mandatory to take an implicit bias training, because you don't have to be racist to be racist. Like it's something that's been so ingrained and like systematically and institutionalized, like and internalized within America. And so, I mean, recognizing that we have these biases within us is the first step. And then also, communities can be well-meaning, but that doesn't mean they always align with what the community wants. And so they can, you know, have the best intentions, but maybe if they aren't talking and meaningfully engaging with the community themselves, might be going against what they want, or like being, you know, counteractive to their goals. So being really, like James was saying, are you willing to go and talk to them, like regularly meet up with them, go to meetings, see what their definition of justice is? Like, what do they want? What do they envision for their future? Not what do you envision for your future or for them. It's not you're not putting your vision on them. It's them, you know, their community first. That's one thing we learned in it, you know, in the environmental justice clinic is, you know, we are community-based lawyers first. Like, you know, the people come first. And so I think just keeping that in mind when you are doing these kind of efforts, you know, take the implicit bias training and really listen and engage the community you're, you know, engaging with.
Okay, next question is from Mary DeFino. She asked if anyone would be willing to share some personal experience about how they or their friends have been excluded.
Specifically in Vermont, or just in general, like from the outdoor space?
There was no specific there, so speak to whatever you'd like.
Okay. I mean, I think a lot of us have already talked about like lack of access to the outdoors, the fact that like in a lot of urban spaces, you have to like actively seek opportunities to engage with the outdoors. And, you know, that was done on purpose, and that continues to have an effect on the way that BIPOC communities especially engage with the outdoors and with the environment. So yeah, I mean, just the fact that I have to like go travel to a place in order to hike, you know, and I think I didn't recognize that until I started going to Vermont Law School, and there was a hiking trail like within walking distance from my apartment. And like that is just not something that has ever been accessible to me. And so I think, yeah, just access in general, just based on proximity to the outdoors. And yeah, that's, I guess, my experience.
What I'll say is that a lot of the exclusion, especially for people of color, Black people specifically, when it comes to the environment, because of the generational exclusion, we kind of exclude ourselves, you know, in the sense of, for example, when I would, I was privileged enough to live in a middle class community. My father was the only one in his entire family to make it out into middle class. And so when I would go see anybody else in my family, we would obviously have to go to certain areas. And at a very young age, I would always ask my mom in the car, why are the trees disappearing? Where are they going? And she'd be like, what do you mean the trees disappearing? I'm like, well, we got a bunch in our backyard. I haven't seen any in the last, couple blocks. And so we automatically don't have that connection. And so because we don't have that connection, we sometimes may or may not think that we belong in that space, right? Until somebody comes along who grew up differently, who has been exposed to it. And then, maybe we start to feel comfortable with it, or maybe we don't. So in order to at least, from my personal opinion, to really kind of get to the exclusion part of people of color in these spaces, that we have to combat the general trauma that was put on us over centuries in terms of us not belonging. How do we do that? What does that look like? That's a longer conversation. I'm willing to have it, obviously for a fee, but no, I'm just joking. But not really. But anyways, but yeah. So it's not as simple as really just what can we do now. It needs to be a process, and it needs to have steps. It needs to start with, hey, you're invited here, have a day here, experience things, be introduced to new things. If you don't like it, come back. It's gonna take some easing into, to really get everybody to feel comfortable to just jump into this this part of the community that for so long has been so white and so elite, and intimidating, very, very intimidating.
I think, so I was reading a few things, and for BIPOC to be more included in things, I think it's important to, again, I think Ariel mentioned this before, have them be included in the history, or have them be included in the education. And I was reading somewhere that it would be really beneficial to offer some type of free admission, because I was talking about before how maybe admission fees or the high cost of some recreation activities like kayaking or boating might hinder some participation, but having maybe a reduced fee, a free fee for first-time recreation users, or having a tax incentive to some recreation users would increase recreation users among BIPOC. And I think that would be really beneficial.
The last thing I just want to throw this in there is that you have to be okay with a culture shift. If you're including Black people into whatever it is that you're doing, we're trendsetters, right? So like, we're very loud, and we like to be who we are, and we like to have our space, and you can't try to simulate us into what it is that you want your culture to be. You can introduce it, we will respect it, because we are respectful people, but at the same time we still are who we are, and for us to be admitted into that space should not involve us to leave behind our identity, right? So we shouldn't have to become somebody else in order to fit into where it is that we should be allowed to be freely anyways. Just, that's something that I want to just throw in there.
I agree.
I think
completely.
that's important too. Yeah, what James was saying. I mean, Du Bois wrote about it in The Soul of Black Folk. We have to have two identities, and I don't think it should be that way anymore. Like, we should be who we are, no matter what space we're in. Shouldn't have to conform to the white space to fit in. We should just be able to be ourselves. And so I think Jameson made a great point. And if you haven't read The Soul of Black Folk, it's a great book. W. Du Bois, amazing.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts tonight. And thank you to everyone who attended tonight on Zoom, on Facebook, wherever you're coming from, far and wide. we really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight about these important issues. I'm going to paste in the chat here a link to follow-up resources if you'd like to educate yourselves. We hope that your conversations with others will not end with this conversation tonight. We hope that you'll make a meditation every day to talk about with yourself how you can evaluate your whiteness and how you can work on yourselves. So thank you again to everyone. I just want to make a quick pitch. We will have another webinar coming up next week. It will be on climate in the age of COVID, and it will again follow the theme of tough conversations. So in theme, we have masks here. Here's our state bird. Please join us next week. We'll enjoy seeing you and hearing your questions again. And I hope you're excited to hear from another group of young leaders.
In the words
Bye,
of
everyone.
go make some good trouble.
Yes, good trouble. Thank you, everyone.